On to shocking charges shrouded in mystery. A federal indictment released late yesterday says former House Speaker Dennis Hastert is charged with trying to hide bank transactions for hush money and lying to the FBI about cash withdrawals of $1.7 million. The indictment says it is all part of an alleged deal Hastert made to provide $3.5 million in order to compensate for and conceal his prior misconduct against an unidentified person listed only Individual A. The indictment does not spell out the nature of said misconduct, but it does reference on page 1 Hastert's time before he entered politics, when he spent 16 years as a teacher and wrestling coach in Yorkville, Illinois. The indictment says Individual A has been a Yorkville resident and has known Hastert most of his or her life. A federal law enforcement official tells NBC News this afternoon that Hastert was making the payments to a man in order to conceal a sexual relationship they had while the man was a student at Yorkville High School. The panel is back with me. Kurt, revisiting Hastert and the era of Hastert brings to mind a myriad scandals that plagued Republican leadership. There was the Foley scandal, wherein he was sending inappropriate lewd messages to a male page. There, of course, was Tom DeLay and his scandals with Jack Abramoff. I mean, how much do you think the Republican Party is going to have to deal with this again? I
don't think the Republican Party will have to. I mean, it's...
Or Congress.
It would be better for them if you were a Democrat. But it is interesting that the party of family values does seem to have...
A family values problem.
A family values problem. To me, though, beyond the reasons for his blackmail, apparent blackmail, the fact that a guy who left high school teaching, unable to become an assistant principal for politics, and served 20 years in politics, made millions of dollars as a congressman, and then has made many millions more as a lobbyist. Enough, that is, to pay this guy, whoever it was, $3.5 million. That's a shocking thing, more than any sexual misconduct he did when he was 30.
And didn't pay, and apparently said, so he tapered the size of these cash withdrawals he was making so as to avoid financial oversight, and said at one point that he was withdrawing the money because he did not trust the banking system, Janelle, with his cash, so presumably was keeping it for himself and stuffing it under his mattress.
That also stood out in the indictment for me. I thought it was particularly interesting that a man who had been a former U.S. government official thought it would be wise to say to the FBI that he did not trust the banking system and that this would be believed and would just sort of go over. Okay. So are you no longer using checking accounts?
Exactly,
how are you doing
right.
your Bitcoin?
It's just Bitcoin, all Bitcoin all the time. I also think, you know, we are at a point now, McKay, where public confidence in our elected officials specifically and in Congress is at an all-time low. And that is like a bad thing for our democracy. It is bad to malign Congress. I think it's bad to starve Congress and have pay freezes and ensure that the only people in Congress are people that can afford to be in Congress, which is to say mostly rich people. I mean, we have a whole set of problems that plague this institution that also happens to be doing nothing.
Right, and that's why I think what Kurt said, you know, I mean, obviously Republicans would prefer that this was not happening to a Republican, but at the end of the day, the animosity, the public animosity flowing toward Congress is not actually that partisan. I mean, if you break down the numbers, sometimes Democrats have slightly more support, sometimes Republicans have slightly more support, depending on the time. But the fact is, stories like this, all they do is add one more data point to the general belief that Congress is full of crooks and corrupt people. And what's also interesting, though, is if you ask people their opinion on their local congressman, who they might know a lot more about, they tend to have much higher
opinion.
Especially Denny Hastert until the day yesterday.
Right.
The one thing the Republicans are going to have to do is come up with a new name for their convention that more than half their caucus has to vote for something. It's no longer the Hastert rule, I'm betting.
A rule which Speaker John Boehner has broken several times, but by which they presume to still govern. Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, who came in after the sort of Hastert reign to clean up and drain the swamp, was on MSNBC just a few hours ago, was asked about this. Let us hear what she had to say.
When Mr. Hastert was the Speaker, our run for winning the House in '06 was to say that we were running against a culture of corruption, cronyism, and incompetence. At the time, there were many indictments, but we had no idea that that would include the Speaker of the House.
I don't know, Janelle. Does this, I mean, to McKay's point, we tried. it goes on.
Are you asking me if this is the nature of Congress?
Yeah, I don't know. Is this the nature of power? Is it corrupting? Although this happened when he wasn't in Congress. Although the payoffs happened, presumably after that.
In fairness, you know, his actual crime is not something that he appears to, as far as we know, in terms of the details that have emerged. The actual crime that was committed here was the act of structuring these withdrawals from his bank in such a way to try to avoid federal reporting requirements and then lying to the FBI.
Right.
So it's the cover-up of the cover-up of the cover-up.
It is. Literally. The actual means by which he made payments to someone who may have been extorting him and then lying about the fact that he was doing so. If he had in fact told the truth to the FBI, he might not be facing federal charges.
He would just be $3.5 million poorer.
The reality is it is not actually illegal to pay someone who is extorting you.
So,
right,
which I think is like news to most people.
I did not know that. That's
it is.
Good to know.
Fascinating.
I would like to get
going to be something that would drive someone who feels that they have something to lose, like power, and the possibility of being shamed. So it is something to keep in mind.
Speaking of power, but having nothing to do with the Hastert story, I do want to get this in. This week, many in the media noted that Hillary Clinton's return to South Carolina also marked the return of a Southern drawl.
To live again at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But I don't want to be there all by myself.
Is that a Southern drawl? I listened to it 3 times.
The vowels a little bit.
Softening of a vowel.
But this is okay. I think it's funny. I mean, I think it's there. But the thing is, I heard it. But this is a very common thing. Like, you know, when Barack Obama returned to the campaign trail, he started dropping his G's. Remember, like, that's
you play to your audience.
Tim Pawlenty, I remember, adopted a Southern accent for a little bit when he was running,
which is totally weird.
Which is great. And then Mitt Romney didn't adopt an accent, but he tried to use like Southern lingo.
He tried to sound like a human.
And general human language. No, but I mean, it is, I think there's something maybe automatic or reflexive when you're talking to a big group of people in a certain region that, like, maybe you start to talk like them, you know? I still think it's funny, though.
Empathetic.
I think it's a little bit of pandering, though. Come on, it's a little pandering.
Well, what's the difference between empathy and pandering? I don't know. That sounds really cynical.
I think, first of all,
that's your best quote ever.
It's a little sad that this is one of the major news stories of the week.
This is not. This is just a little side kicker to push people through their Friday afternoon.
I think it is also possible that this is a case of nerves. You know, Barack Obama goes into black preacher mode when he steps before large groups. I honestly think it's possible that you can be a little nervous, and in your attempt to connect with people, you start to speak the way that they do. Anybody who interviews people for a living knows a lot about it.
Like Kurt Anderson, who
or when I go home to Nebraska, I lose this fake Eastern thing I've adopted for all these years.
And when I go home to Washington, D.C., I immediately become more cynical and partisan.
And boring.
I'm going to leave it there. Kurt Anderson, Janelle Ross, McKay Coppins, thank you for discussing these important issues.